Chapter 11, page 45. Outside! Everyone outside! Move quickly there! Move! Move, I say! Downstairs, the Strauss family was being marched single file out onto the dark side lawns. The confusion was surreal. Terrible memories began to come back for some of the family members. David Strauss was being helped to his feet, holding his broken, bleeding nose. He was being led forward with the others. Suddenly, the two other Nazi intruders appeared from another side of the house. "Let's go," the soldier called out. "This way, now." The four Nazis ran north into the thickest estate woods. Dogs began to bark at all the neighboring houses. Police sirens could be heard, howling in the direction of the village of Scarsdale. Amazingly, everyone outside seemed to be unharmed. The attack appeared to be over. The Strauss family members began to weep, to hug, and kiss one another. The whir of the sirens got closer. Wide-eyed neighbors were running across North Avenue in housecoats and pajamas. Suddenly, David's Aunt Shirley was pointing back toward the gardens. Everything became deadly quiet. Everyone just stared. David turned and stared too. In front of Grandpa Sam's pear and box trees, right in front of an old gazebo brought down from the Cherrywoods Hotel. "Rotten, pathetic, filthy bastards." David Strauss spoke in a hoarse whisper. "Oh, you rotten sons of bitches." They had burned a 5-foot square swastika on the estate lawns. Chapter 12. Later that night, a 68-year-old man, former SS Colonel Herman Reinman, sat in his old world decor New York City apartment. He tried, unsuccessfully, to be reasonably calm. Colonel Reinman watched the ABC television replays of the Academy Awards slayings, then the Scarsdale attack. Reinman then tried to watch a movie until the next news report at 2:30. At 2:30, he watched the last news on Channel 9. At 3:30, he watched the final news on ABC. At 4:30, he walked his dog on the empty, steaming streets of Upper East Side Manhattan. When he returned from his walk, he fixed himself toast and tea with lemon, but he found he was too excited to eat once he had prepared the food. Something called Not for Women Only was on TV. At 7 a.m., CBS began its morning news with more clips from the previous night. Finally, at 8, New York time, Herman Reinman made a long-distance phone call to La Paz, Bolivia. A man-servant answered the phone. Reinman inquired if Senor Eleazar was up at his usual hour. If Senor Eleazar was available to come to the telephone. Yes, it was very, very important. Yes, he would wait. The next voice Colonel Reinman heard was that of Senor Eleazar. Senor Eleazar, who had once been known by another, much more famous and powerful-sounding name. In a hushed voice, Herman Reinman began to describe in great detail what he was watching on the Today Show's 8 o'clock news. The raids, the warning, the Chow's Way. Part 2. Chapter 13. Henry Bendel's New York City. Her thick black hair blazing like the mane of a thoroughbred, Alex Rothschild struck a New York Vogue pose beneath the rich brown and creamy canopy of Henry Bendel's on West 5th, 7th Street. Behind Alex in Bendel's glossy window, the arms and legs of several mannequins were strewn on top of broken light bulbs and colorful bazaar streamers. In a second window, there was a much tastier display from Bailey Hubnar, one of the boutiques on the ground floor inside the building. When Alex had been 10, she remembered her Uncle Benny had bought her a white beaver topper from this very same wonderfully screwy department store. Now Alex was shivering in a summery Halston gown. She was also falsely representing a cloying new women's fragrance called Tricot, the French word for knitted sweater. She hoped someone at the Madison Avenue perfume factory realized. For 3 magazine ads and 2 television commercials, Alex Rothschild would receive $250,000 to promote Tricot, a scent very much like Rive Gaucher, Charlie, Windsong, Sachet, Babe, a touch less alcohol, a smidgen more jasmine, and Alex Rothschild. All around the dark-haired actress there was flashing Mylar reflectors on aluminum tripods. No more than an arm's length away was an expensive troupe of makeup, fashion, and hairstylists, dabbing, blotting, curling, crimping, glossing, spraying, powdering, making certain that Alex Rothschild looked perfect, which Alex did. An art director, photographer, assistant director, and account executive told her so. The crowd gathered around Alex showed it was there, approving smiles and wide eyes. Even Bendel's ancient doorman, Buster, looked mildly animated, or at least amused. Gorgeous, darling. Perf, Alex. Sexy kitten now. Alex heard the shop talk among the reflectors. Marushka got herself preggers in New Hampshire. Yes, she did, too. I heard it from Kimberly over at Elite. Alex's mind, meanwhile, was drifting. Whenever the crowds and bright Klieg lights suggested to Alex that she was someone special, her own tremendous guilt, her terrible visions, came rushing in to countermand the pleasant experience. This time it was worse than it had ever been, Alex realized. Instead of chic, expensive perfumes, she could smell petrifying corpses. Instead of the wealthy Fifth Avenue crowd, she saw a line of stick-limbed, bent-over prisoners in striped prison garb with big yellow stars branded on their backs and chests. 35 years before, Alex Rothschild's mother had died horribly on one of those terrifying lines. At Dauch Konzentrationslager. Her father had died in Buchenwald. Alex was one of nearly 1 million concentration camp survivors in the United States. Lately, she'd become obsessed. Ever since the Nazi raid in Westchester, ever since the threat of some kind of uprising by the Reich, Alex had been able to think of nothing else. On May 7, 1945, church bells, fire alarms, and air raid sirens had tolled and pealed all through ravaged Western Europe, inside Russia, all the way to America. The terrible war in Europe was finally over. Winston Churchill had said, "This moment is a signal for the greatest outburst of joy in the history of mankind." What Alex Rothschild remembered was a long, grim line of German civilians. The American army had forced them to come and visit Dachau after the liberation. Their heads hanging low, protesting their innocence, the Germans were led through the rotting barracks filled with dying men, women, and children. The Germans were shown the rows of gallows where men, women, and children had been hanged, the torture racks and laboratories, the crematoriums, still packed with human ashes, the last attempts to exterminate a few more. It was the UNRRA that eventually found shelter for some 200 Dachau children at the Kloster Indersdorf monastery due north of the death camp. Among the children's survivors was 3-year-old Alex Rothman. The monastery experience was a sad and unreal one too. Little bald children, their stomachs swollen from malnutrition, followed the UNRRA people around constantly, telling their personal stories over and over. Though there was sufficient food at Kloster Indersdorf, the children continued to steal. The Dachau children said that they couldn't help it. A few of them who broke the habit early would leave the dining refectory proudly showing the nurses that they had empty hands and pockets. In bizarre contrast to the actual DP camps, a photo essay appeared in Life magazine in 1945. In 18 photographs, 2 pretty little Heidi types were shown having a typical camp experience. The girls were then followed across Europe as they bravely hitchhiked with their life photographer, of course, back to their homes. The pretty blonde girls were shown making friends with an American doughboy, having a medical exam, their hair is washed and well brushed, being given an extra hot chocolate before they began their cross-country jaunt. No wonder that so many Americans came to believe that the death camp and DP camp horror stories had to be bizarre exaggerations. When Alex was 3.5, her aunt and uncle finally came to Kloster-Indersdorf to claim her. They took the little girl to America, the land of Life magazine, where Alex was told to blend into the melting pot, where she was told to forget all those terrible things that happened, where she became Rothschild instead of Rothman. I just can't do this anymore, Alex muttered to herself, standing in front of Bendel's. Then suddenly she announced it to the large commercial crew. Do what, love? The director started to walk toward her. I can't sell any more perfumes or wash your hair once an hour shampoos or automobiles or anything. I'm sorry. Alex began to push her way out through the film crew. Please excuse me. Please don't touch me. With that, the actress hurried away down 57th. She turned onto 5th Avenue in her Houston gown. A spring wind was coming up the street. Alex was feeling a little better now, able to breathe at least. She tried to forget about Dachau and Buchenwald. As she walked, Alex looked down at her feet, a size 10B, and she wondered why she had ever thought they looked good in white. Rowboats from Charles Jordan. Alex Rothschild also wondered why people thought she was at all pretty. Chapter 14. Nestled midway between Albany and New York City, 10 miles northwest of beautiful Monarch and Minnewaska, the famous Strauss family hotel was set high in the Shawangunk Mountains. The multi-winged and turreted hotel was somebody's fantastic idea for an American-style castle. With more than 550 rooms, Cherrywoods Mountain House was actually two great, sprawling hotels, one building on either side of 300-foot-high shale cliffs separated by a shimmering black lake. Because they were originally constructed in stages over 60 years' time, the houses combined several conflicting styles of European and American architecture. In fact, approaching the mountain house from the main gravel road, the near wing and livery stable looked not so much like one style, but rather like 10 or 12 different styles, and the buildings were in different colors. Most awesome and beautiful, however, were the grounds of the resort hotel. More than 200 acres of gardens, grape arbors, barber-cut lawns, and virgin woods, which hotel guests were encouraged to tour on foot or even in a horse-drawn buckboard. From most rooms there was a breathtaking view over the evergreens and apple farms that stretched nearly to Newburgh, some 30 miles distant on a thin blue ribbon that turned out to be the Hudson River. Rockefellers, Roosevelts, Vanderbilts, and Kennedys had the wind knocked out of their sails by the Cherrywoods Mountain House view, the finest view on the Atlantic coast, travel editors raved. Someone really ought to make a scary movie here, Nick Strauss had always said, and once had shamelessly suggested to hotel guest Roman Rosemary's Babel Polanski. Maybe someone would make a horror film there, Dr. David Strauss thought as he surveyed the land one overcast and particularly graphic afternoon. For it was at Cherrywoods Mountain House where the members of the Strauss family were sequestered under specially arranged for FBI protection, and where they waited in safety, hoping that their lives would soon return to normal. Chapter 15. In the beginning of David's stay, the 3 weeks before the hotel reopened for regular guests, just a trickle of Cherrywoods' normal spring business, though, he rarely went out of his suite of rooms on the 5th floor of West House. David Strauss was obsessed with his grandmother's, his brother's, and his wife's murders. David was particularly obsessed with memories of his and Heather's life together before the evening of April 25th in Scarsdale. Once he began to go out on the hotel grounds, David tried to lose himself in a flurry of physical activity. Mornings at dawn, he rode a modified Skull around and around Lake Arrow. He went for long solitary swims and long jogs through the pine forest. In the afternoons, David offered a free medical clinic for hotel workers and their families. He tacked up a very unofficial looking sign in one of the long hallways on the ground floor. Dr. David Strauss, hours 3 p.m. until I'm finished. More and more, though, David found himself being drawn to the subject of modern-day Nazis. He pored over Nazi books and stared at old Nazi movies with unhealthy attention. Almost daily he tried to reach an old friend of his grandmother's, the famous Nazi hunter Michael Ben Ivan. Ben Ivan, however, never seemed to be at his home in Frankfurt. I'm sorry, Ben Ivan is away in Israel. Ben Ivan is on business in England, David heard from the old man's secretary. David had always over-intellectualized the Nazis. He decided midway through his reading and research. So who exactly were these Nazis? He now asked himself over and over like a monotonous broken record. In May of 1980, who were they? Who was it that had attacked his family on Upper North Avenue? Who had murdered Heather? Why? In a suite of hotel rooms, David stockpiled some 300 Nazi books and pamphlets, many of them supplied by the Ulster County Lending Library Association. Among the Nazi books were Hugh Trevor Roper's The Last Days of Hitler, Thomas Mann's Order of the Day, hefty tomes by Walter Langer, Michael Bar Zohar, Scheer, Speer, Toland, The Final Solution, Hitler's 12 Apostles. There was also the swastika covered and quite stupefy hate book, pornographic Nazi paperbacks imported from a drugstore in nearby Poughkeepsie, Gestapo prison brothel, and Bitch of Buchenwald, and the National Socialist White People's Party songbook to the tune of Jingle Bells, riding through the Reich in a big Mercedes-Benz, killing lots of kikes, making lots of friends. There was also the Holocaust volume of the Jewish Encyclopedia, the complete Lucy Rabinowitz, Samson the Nazarite, and Jabotinsky. Almost daily now, too, a man named Harry Callaghan from the FBI brought David new information, data on known Nazi organizations still flourishing anywhere. From all of this information, Strauss began to compile his own composite book, Score on the Nazis. They certainly knew who he was. Now David wanted to know all about them, literally everything about the Nazis. The American Nazi Party now calls itself the National Socialist White People's Party. David wrote in a foolscap notepad. Based in Alexandria, Virginia, FBI guesstimates 800 to 2,000 active members. The National States Rights Party, out of Marietta, Georgia, hate sheet called Thunderbolt, distributed to 15,000 members every month. Members include Fred Cohen, New Rochelle, furniture mover who went berserk in 1976, killing 5 people in Westchester. American Nazi splinter groups. The National Socialist Party of America, based in Chicago, attempted Nazi march through Skokie, Illinois on June 4, 1977. The National Socialist Women's Organization, Chicago. The National Socialist League, Gay Nazis, Los Angeles. A small group in Pennsylvania called Stormtroopers, but considered harmless by FBI. International Nazi groups and movements. Die Spine, the Spider, leaves no mailing address, not considered harmless. The same goes for Die Schluss, El Aragini, and Odessa. Day after day, David Strauss rummaged through or just stared at the hateful stacks of Nazi papers and Nazi books. He wondered exactly which page had killed his brother, his grandmother, his wife. Every night when David closed his eyes, he saw after images of the funerals. Heather's funeral had been disturbingly peaceful. An Episcopal cemetery called Evergreen, blue skies overhead. tall, full-bowed trees like those in Van Gogh's final paintings at Airless. Nicholas, Elena, and Barry services had been at Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue. The funeral was held the day after the shootings, according to Jewish law. As David lay in his bed at Cherrywoods, he could see himself riding to the funeral in a somber, tomb-like limousine. The trees along Fifth Avenue were silently flashing by the limousine's windows. His own face was reflected on the windows, dark, dreamlike, severe. There were nearly 4,000 people at the temple. Gray police barricades had been set up for 3 blocks in either direction on Fifth. 2 pale blue police buses sat at 67th Street, which happened to be the site of the Soviet embassy. David held the arms of his 2 great aunts as he slowly walked down the roped-off entranceway to the temple. Inside the temple, David's gaze fell down the long center aisle. At the sight of the 3 plain pine caskets, his eyes filled. A cantor with a basso profundo voice began to sing. A swirling wave made up of sadness and immeasurable loss turned David's stomach inside out. He felt lightheaded. You never know how much you're going to miss people. At that moment, David was certain he couldn't go on without them. Dear, dear Heather and Elena, and Nick and Barry. Not only family, his 4 best friends in the world, his flesh, a physical and spiritual part of David gone without warning. Chapter 16. Dr. David Strauss ran to punish his body. It seemed for what sin or sin of omission he wasn't exactly sure. He ran to prepare himself. For what Olympic task he wasn't sure of either. 6 miles a day at first, then 8 miles, 10 miles, and then heartbreaking quarter-mile sprints. Probably because he was a doctor, David pretended to himself that the running would help to lower his blood pressure. It would decrease his cholesterol. It would build up his cardiopulmonary fitness. Pure folly. David really ran for the pain. During what David called his ruthless runs, he had no memory, no practical necessities, no tragic past or frightening, very unsure future. There was just the physical act of running, the cleansing pain. There was pushing himself to his absolute limits. There was teaching his body to accept extra pain like heel spurs, runner's knee, and groin pulls. There was learning to control without oxygen before a second wind came. There was learning to run hard in spite of crippling excesses of lactic acid. One overcast afternoon, the FBI chief, Harry Callahan, approached David about his running. Callahan was short-haired, physically fit, in his mid-40s. He was tall and gauntly thin. He reminded David of a New England college professor or Gregory Peck trying to play a college professor role. He was getting a little soft puttering around Cherrywoods, the agent said. Could he possibly work out a little with David? Might he tag along on one of the ruthless runs? David didn't like the idea, but he didn't know how to say no politely. He recoiled from the thought of having a running partner, someone who might take his mind off the pure physical act. A little before 5 p.m., Callahan appeared in a burnt orange and red USMC t-shirt and loose Georgetown basketball shorts showing pale white and freckled legs. David wore gray and red striped snowbirds, ancient pumas, and faded apple green shirt and shorts, and an old ratty sweatband that had evolved from snowy white to gray. David was completing a hybrid combination of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the West Point fitness drills when Callahan came up to him on the lake porch. No, Dr. Strauss, you don't do the West Point drills before you run." The FBI agent couldn't really believe what he was seeing. "I do a few sit-ups, squats, leg and knee raises before I go out," David said. "When I come back in, I try to do another set with rocking sit-ups and isometrics." Callahan shook his head from side to side. This was the first time he'd realized that Dr. Strauss was a bit more than just another fitness nut. The 2 men completed the final exercise side by side on the groaning wooden porch. Grunting and cursing, they did squats, leg thrusts, and raised push-ups. Acidic sweat began to waterfall into Harry Callahan's eyes. His tiger corsairs sloshed as they began to fill with water. Gnats and horseflies landed on his glistening back as if it were the National Insects aircraft carrier. David strapped a yellowish cowhide pack onto his back and shoulders. The backpack was a professional training device made by Dunlap. It could hold from 20 to 50 pounds of lead weight, and David had it full. "Do you mind if I run with this?" he said. "You know what I'm going to say. I'm the doctor, right? Or maybe you should see a doctor." "Okay, I'm ready. Run from the hips, Mr. Callahan. Breathe from the belly." David smiled for the first time. "Let's go, partner." They ran straight back into the tall evergreen forest. Very cool in the shade. Actually, quite nice, Harry Callahan thought as his feet patted softly on the pine needles. Maybe the worst of it had been the exercises. Seeming to sense the FBI's agent's content, David turned onto one of the winding trails leading up onto Lookout Mountain. Here, the lie of land was steep and rocky. The running of the two men became closer to mountain climbing. After 2.5 miles of mountain, Harry Callahan began to feel an uneasy tightness and burning in his chest, shortness of breath, tightening in his upper legs. At first, he guessed that Dr. Strauss was trying strongly to discourage him from tagging along again. The FBI man struggled to keep up beside David Strauss. "What are you trying to do to yourself?" Callahan asked in a puffing, grunting voice. "What are you trying to do to me?" Very suddenly, though, in an intuitive flash, Callahan knew exactly what David Strauss was doing on his ruthless runs. "You're getting yourself ready," Callahan huffed, his heavy steps landing like small bombs now. "Want to fight them, don't you? Nazis? Stormtroop?" David Strauss began to pick up the pace. He tried to ignore the agent. "Little stitch in my side, diaphragm spasm. Getting my second wind, though." "You can't fight them." Callahan was struggling to keep up with the younger man. His chest was twisting tighter and tighter. His legs felt leaden. His neck and shoulders ached. "The fuck I can't. If I ever get the chance, I goddamn will. Fight the bastards. Murdering coward bastards. They're not going. Challenge you to a foot race, doctor." David said nothing. That made Harry Callahan angry. Damn it, he knew about the Reich. Callahan knew more about the Nazis than just about any field man in the Bureau. He could help. This was his job. David Strauss was choosing to ignore him, though, acting as if the agent were some kind of useless second asshole. Furious, Harry Callahan stuck his foot out. He knew he shouldn't have the second he did. Not professional, Henry, not rational. David fell hard and fast, as if he'd been hit by a bullet from a sniper's rifle. Something Harry Callahan had seen happen to a man. The green shirt and shorts, the wheeling arms and legs, flipped, somersaulted, and rolled to an exaggerated stop against a wall of scrub pines. "You might as well learn a lesson right now," the FBI agent called down from the main trail. "The Nazis run dirty, Dr. Strauss. Remember that." Harry Callahan headed back to the Cherrywoods Hotel, walking slowly. Chapter 17. The realization that she was maybe royally screwing up her life, her acting career at least, came to Alex Rothschild slowly over a couple of weeks in mid-spring. First, there had been the $1 million perfume stink in front of Henry Bendel's. Then another tempest in a teapot in the cafe of the Sherry Netherland with a slick packager representing CBS, MFA, and apparently $2 million. Now there was the most uncomfortable tableau of all. At her movie company's New York offices high over Central Park South, Alex's agent, Mark Halperin, was there, a California golden boy. He was biting his manicured nails, sliding his sunglasses in and out of a breast pocket of his western shirt, rubbing the soles of his fashionably soiled tennis sneakers together. Also present in the posh business office was Arnold Manning, former president of one of the few remaining large studios in Hollywood. The gonzo independent producer was unattractive. He was bald and stout. Manning sat in the midst of a coterie of studio lawyers, accountants, and other vice presidents. These overindulged men seem to confuse themselves with their company's movie stars and directors. Arnold Manning spoke to Alex in the softest voice, as if she were a wayward but much-loved daughter, which in a way Alex was. Must I remind you, Alex, dear sweet, confused later, that we have a three-picture arrangement, you and I. That's 4 movies, 3 movies. That's 4 movies, 3 movies. That's fine, Arnold. Alex nodded. I just haven't liked the scripts you've been sending me. One of the studio heads reared ugly. Point of information, Alex. As I understand it, Jackie Bissett didn't like the script for The Deep. Dick Dreyfuss didn't want to do Jaws. Facts. Alex looked away and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows that were rattling soft in their giant aluminum frames. Outside was Columbus Circle, lovely Central Park in late spring. No visions of concentration camps today. No Dachau. No Buchenwald. Not yet, anyway. Please, listen. Alex turned back to Arnold Manning. On her face was a small child's hurt look. Crestfallen green eyes. The slightest thin-lipped mouth. I promise to do the 3 pictures for you. I promise. I owe you, Arnold. I also kind of love you, dear, sweet, dark, confusing. I forget the rest, man. Arnold Manning looked hurt now. The slightest fat-lipped mouth. You forget sexy as hell. For the first time in the morning, Alex smiled. Arnold, I need a little time to be by myself. This terrible Nazi scare, Basically, I have to get away from being such a big deal to everyone I'm around. I need to think. I need to be a plain nobody for a while. No admirers, no catty detractors. Alex Rothschild smiled again, and I'm aware, Mr. Manning, that at the rate I'm going, I could be a nobody for a long, long time to come. Arnold Manning began to laugh as if he were being tickled by chimps with pink feathers. The peculiar laugh grew until the stout, bald man let out a howl. So go away, Alex. I agree you have to relax. I agree you need some time by yourself. Everybody does. I understand what this horrible neo-Nazi business must mean to you. Manning had waited just long enough. Now he was giving Alex back her own ideas, almost her own words. They both knew what he was doing, but that was fine. That was the secret of the relationship between Alex Rothschild and Arnold Manning. Where are you thinking of going, Al? Mark Halperin was still nibbling his sunglasses, just in case your agent needs to get in touch. That's my markup, Alex put on a smile. She was trying to be like her old self again. Leave them laughing. Alex had long ago learned on agency casting calls. I was thinking of going upstate for a while, in a week or so. I have an old friend up there who knows how to treat me like I'm nobody. He still calls me Alex Rothman. Alex stood up, and the whole room of suits and sunglasses rose with her. I'll be going to a place called Cherrywoods Mountain House, but I won't be accepting any phone calls. Chapter 18. On Sunday afternoon, David Strauss sat on a bench out along one of the Cherrywoods' prettiest nature trails. Besides him was the FBI agent, Harry Callahan. I'm sorry about the other day, our running debut, Callahan said. I was trying to help, at least to let you know that I was available. I got mad when you shut me off. I'm sorry about what happened too, David nodded. You were right. What you were trying to tell me, I was being a shithead. It's just that I have this unbelievable hate building up inside me. No outlet for it. It's hard to communicate exactly. Not so hard. I can imagine at least some of what you must feel. I would like to help, though. That's what I'm here for. My job. My vocation, you might say. From their spot on the Woodlands Trail, David and Callahan had a perfect view west across the Rondout Valley to the Rip Van Winkle Mountains. Hundreds of millions of years ago, David said, all the land around here was covered by a great inland lake. My grandfather used to tell me that every time the two of us came up here. David Strauss smiled. I guess I'm still off in my own world a little. Lots of family stuff floating around in my head. Yeah, well, when you come back down to earth, don't forget what I've been trying to tell you, please. Don't get me confused with any of the Washington bureaucrat images that you probably have, which I have, for God's sake. I appreciate what you're trying to do, really. I'm going to be fine, David promised. Chapter 19. David couldn't get the idea that Heather was dead out of his mind, that she was gone from his life, forever and always, never to be heard or seen by him again. Distractions helped, David had to admit. The more peculiar the distraction, the better. When he'd been an undergraduate at Princeton, David had begun a curious diary journal that he called his crap book. The crap book now contains such treasures as a visitor's pass into Olympic Village in Munich, a college letter for schooling, one of his favorite first lines from a book, like most men, I tell 100 lies a day, all sorts of junk that antique people call collectibles. To the more whimsical first half of the book, David now added an obsessive collection of clippings on the North Avenue Nazi attack. He passed in news stories on other suspected stormtroop activity, a synagogue bombing on Long Island, the grisly murder of an influential rabbi doctor in Chicago. He put in condolences on Elena's and Nick's murder from important Jewish leaders all over the world, and selected Naziana from his ever-expanding library. While the scrapbook helped David maintain some balance of sanity, what seemed to help more were the medical clinics he offered every weekday afternoon. A general practitioner for the first time in his career, David suddenly found himself treating asthma, Rossellio croup, enlarged prostate, insomnia, and peptic ulcers. Most important, while he was treating one of the hotel staff, David felt useful again. Inside his office at the hotel, Dr. David Strauss could just about feel alive. Late one afternoon, while he was treating a gardener's child for a raging case of poison ivy, the head of the FBI team dropped by at his office. Callahan sat on the edge of David's examining table. He ran his finger across the bottom of young Neil Becton's foot. The boy started to giggle. Callahan grinned too, and it was the first time David had seen any sign of humor coming from the FBI agent. We've just gotten a strange report. Callahan tamped down on his pipe, then lit it. The report says that Borman may have recently entered the United States through Miami. Did your family ever have any contact with that bastard, David? In the concentration camps in Germany? Even the most remote contact? As he dabbed Abilene cream onto Niels Becton's inflamed legs, David began to feel slightly whimsical, a bit lightheaded. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since the Westchester attack. Reichsfuhrer Martin Bormann, short, squat man. Yeah, sure, we knew him. He used to come to breakfast at our house when I was just a boy. My grandmother Elena would serve Nova and bagels, and he'd get all sorts of pissed off. Just the far corner of Harry Callahan's mouth broke. Half a smile showed. The other thing, Callahan went on without giving David the satisfaction of a real laugh. One of the few American Nazi hunters has been in contact with us. Benjamin Rabinowitz, a friend of your grandmother's? David nodded. He'd heard quite a bit about Rabinowitz. For years, Elena had been a contributor to Rabinowitz's efforts. In fact, she contributed to Rabinowitz in America and to Michael Ben Iben's Center for Jewish Studies in Europe. David knew. Rabinowitz has some interesting theories I'd like you to react to. The only slight catch, Callahan began to relight his pipe, is we'd have to leave the hotel for a few hours tomorrow. Rabinowitz doesn't want to be seen with you. He actually seemed somewhat paranoid, frightened. David felt a chill shoot up his spine. He had an ominous feeling that maybe something was going to happen now. Maybe the Nazi hunter would have some new and important information. Something revealing about the Nazi stormtroop. I'd like to meet Mr. Rabinowitz very much, he said. Tomorrow is fine with me. I'd be glad to meet him anywhere. David Strauss didn't realize it as he stood in his doctor's office that afternoon, but his personal hunt for the neo-Nazis had just begun. Chapter 20. The Sans Saucy Restaurant, Washington, D.C. The Fuhrer and the warrior were eating rare steaks and sipping red wine, enjoying as amiable and light-hearted a supper as was evident anywhere in the clubby, chatty Washington, D.C. dining room. A pleasure, as it always is here. The warrior sipped his burgundy, letting the fine red roll on his tongue. He then wiped his crinkly, puffed mouth. The Fuhrer smiled in agreement. A very decent steak. I want steak. Even at approximately $25 a pound. That's expensive. Their attentive waiter, Randolph, came with 2 snifters of Courvoisier. I believe it is time now, the warrior said. You have wined me and dined me most graciously. Now we must talk. For the next 15 minutes, the Fuhrer was alternatively a graceful diplomat, a moralist, a harsh military strategist. The complete plan for the operation known as Dachau II was revealed to the warrior. The plot was mercilessly torn to shreds and then rebuilt from the remnants. Truly terrifying and unassailable this time. Black coffee was ordered by the warrior. The face and broad neck of the white-maned man had grown bright scarlet red over the intense quarter of an hour. Finally, the Fuhrer said in a nerveless monotone that was chilling, my group will strike. The effect will be like nothing ever seen, an extraordinary blitzkrieg even in this age. The warrior answered slowly with grave consideration showing in every line of his face. If it was anyone other than you who had asked this of me, I would say no, no, no. The risks of your plan are almost unconscionable. Because it is you who ask, however, I must give my tentative approval. The Fuhrer started to speak, but the warrior slowly raised his hand. Not approval to proceed, my friend. Approval to seek further guidance from the other council members. You now have 1 negative vote. My vote is no. The Fuhrer's head remained bowed for several seconds. Words finally came with obvious difficulty and great emotion. I have to tell you a most difficult thing now. You see, I have already approached the other members of the council. I have all 5 votes. Yours is the only negative vote. The warrior nodded. I must fight you then, he said. I will use all of my resources. Outside the Washington, D.C. restaurant, the warrior and the Fuhrer got into separate black limousines, one with bulletproof windows, the other with DPL license plate. As one of the limousines crossed Victory Bridge, the black car sparked suddenly, like a match being lit in a stiff wind. There was a bright red and yellow flame at the center of the famous bridge. Then dark metal fell on the Potomac like huge raindrops. Back at the Shoreham Hotel, the Fuhrer made a single-sentence phone call. Begin to Chow 2.